I have legit learned more about sage grouse in the past 2 weeks than I have my entire life.
No kidding. Talking to Dave is like taking a master class in sage grouse ecology.
We made the decision to split this episode into 2 parts to make this whole thing more digestible and to keep it under 30 minutes.
So if you recall, in part 1, we talked to Associate Professor Rangeland Wildlife Extension Specialist at Utah State University, Dave Dahlgren. Talked about where the Great Basin is, talked about the sage grouse that live there, and discussed some human-based threats to these birds.
Some people at home might be asking themselves how Dave has learned so much about sage grouse, and we're going to explore that in this episode. It comes from his use with GPS transmitters as well as pointing dogs, but there are still looming threats to the Great Basin sage grouse population, and we're going to introduce a truly insidious character, the invasive species cheatgrass.
Cheatgrass, water, climate, and fire are a potentially disastrous recipe of destruction for this delicate ecosystem. In this episode, AJ and I also identify something we think is an overlooked reason why greater sage grouse are such an at-risk species: Fidelity.
My name is AJ DeRosa, co-host of the Project Upland podcast and founder of Project Upland.
And I'm Gabby Zaldambide, the editor-in-chief of Project Upland magazine and AJ's co-host.
This podcast series is an immersive experience that travels through time, stretches across landscapes, and delivers on the independent storytelling you have come to love.
Listen in as we learn from researchers, biologists, and subject matter experts about birds, nature, conservation, dogs, and more. This is a glimpse into the crazy minds of the folks at Project Upland and the stories that do not always make it to print.
A simple action like rating, reviewing, and subscribing has a huge impact on our small business. If you want to support our independent media further, head over to our Patreon, where you will find behind-the-scenes content, full-length interviews, resources, and even interact with us.
Join us as we travel into the deepest, most obscure, and nerdiest realms of the uplands.
These are your stories.
NASA Technical Reports Server, October 10th, 1972. My final report in summary. Earth-oriented satellite technology provides new opportunities to delve more effectively and more deeply than previously possible into some aspects of the behavior, physiology, and ecology of free-roaming animals in their natural ecosystems, especially in remote areas. These opportunities come at a time when an urgent need exists for accurate information about the migratory patterns of endangered species of whales, the movements and habits of polar bears throughout the Arctic, migrations of caribou in regions of projected oil pipelines, the migratory behavior and island finding system in commercially important species of large sea turtles, new fire regimes, and overgrazing by domestic livestock, and similar problems affecting the future of the total world ecosystem. Helmut Buchner, senior ecologist.
The root of how we're learning so much about sage grouse these days is GPS technology. Dave has worked through the evolution of tracking technology from triangulating radio transmitters or telemetry to now GPS backpacks.
Using GPS technology to track sage grouse movements is a cornerstone of Dave's work. The sheer amount of data that modern GPS units are able to collect has told researchers so much about daily and seasonal sage grouse movements. However, it hasn't always been like this. When Dave first started working with grouse, he used radio telemetry.
I've been at this since 2002. So that's when I started graduate school, when I started trapping sage grouse. We were using little VHF, they're little barrel batteries, with a necklace. So it'd go right around the sage grouse's neck, and it just had a big long antenna that shot down the back. And it would send out a signal, just beep, 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 right? And that's what we used to track birds. So we needed a ground crew of so many people. I can't tell you how many years on a four-wheeler just going everywhere with an antenna trying to hear. My PhD work, they had just come out with these little 1.5 gram VHF radios. They're tiny. We would go in, we'd put a radio on mom, we'd follow her to her nest. Then when she hatched, within 24 hours, we'd go in either in the morning or the evening when it was cold and she was brooding. and we get her off her brood and we collect all those one-day-old chicks. And then we'd suture these little radios between their wings. Each radio had a little tube on the top and bottom of the radio, and then follow them around for we wanted to know what their survival was and could we tell what was killing them. We had GPS technology on big game and other big species for a while, but with birds, the regulations that all of us ornithologists kind of go to is you want to be 3% or less of the body weight for your tag. 5% is like the max that you can do. And so we really got to be getting into that 20 grams, somewhere in the 20s or less for a female sage grouse to be able to handle the weight of that tag and not affect her survival. And so that didn't happen until about 2010-ish. But what we do is we put them around their hips. So they're actually what we call a rump mount. And so they go around the legs, up into the groin and back around the hips. And you just tighten that down so it sits right above their rump feathers. And you just try to balance that thing on the back. We use Teflon ribbon and we sew in a little bit of elastic so they can still jump and get up flight and do all those kinds of things. Now we got our radios, the GPS radios are down in the teens. I just ordered some 15 gram radios and some 10 gram. Once you get into GPS, it goes in all these directions. So there's what's the most simplest is like a store on board. It'll take data and keep it on board. And then you come in with like a base station and an antenna, which is a UHF signal. Once you connect, then it'll download all your data. A lot of the ones I've used, you had to get within like 200 yards of them, and it was onerous to try to do that. And we found a company that's legit. We're getting 2, 3, even I think our longest was 5 miles away, but we could download the data from there. So that's kind of the base. And then you have some that are what we call GSM or cellular. They'll actually have it's not a full SIM card, but it's that kind of thing that'll hook to a cell phone coverage and then send their data through the cell coverage. The problem is if you took grouse habitat in Western North America and you inverted it, that's like the best cell coverage. But if you invert cell coverage, then you have the best sage grouse or grouse habitat. Having coverage and having marked birds is pretty tough. I've never had it be successful. Then we had these satellite radios, so they would take locations, usually for sage grouse, about 6 a day. And then every 3 days, a satellite would pass over and they'd send the data up to the satellite. It would go to France to a company, and then I'd get an email with my data. That was really cool to get data that way. And you get a lot of it. Like with telemetry, if I got one bird, like a single bird, if I got them once a week, I was doing really good. 6 a day, it's crazy. And now my store on boards, 20 minutes. Every 20 minutes, we're getting a location. The amount of data is just crazy. And it's kind of crazy to watch them. Sage grouse spend a lot of time in one area, and all of a sudden, boom, they're 10 miles over here.
Like you'd expect, I had to ask Dave where his pointing dogs intersected with his research. While they tried to use dogs to capture birds, other methods proved more effective, but dogs still did come in for the win.
I didn't have much choice in the matter when it came to dogs. A little background on myself, I was born in a home. I came home from the hospital to a German Shorthair and an English Pointer, and they were my whole world growing up. I have 3 dogs right now. I've got 2 German Shorthairs, Mo and Hayes, and a German Wirehair. Her name is Josie. We just call her Jojo.
Dave originally used his pointers for a sage grouse research project he worked on for his master's degree. Using radio telemetry, he tried to find marked birds in 16 100-acre plots, but all of the birds he tagged were nowhere to be found. He decided to work his dog through the plots to see if unmarked sage grouse were using them, and lo and behold, they were. His dog found over 100 grouse.
Dave tested his theory of using dogs to find grouse in his plots 2 more times. The first time, he called in another graduate student with a bird dog to help. Together, they found 122 grouse. The third time, Dave called in assistance from the Utah Chucker Foundation, and he got enough volunteers to run every single plot simultaneously. They found 121 grouse. Dave verified that no, he was not double sampling, and yes, grouse were using his research plots, even though they weren't the ones he originally tagged with GPS.
In addition to using his dogs for his own research, Dave also co-authored the chapter titled Use of Dogs in Wildlife Research and Management in the Wildlife Society's 2020 edition of the Wildlife Techniques Manual. AJ and I are looking forward to dedicating an episode to this topic sooner rather than later.
We hope this chapter will not only serve as a reference for field practitioners, but also stimulate new applications of dogs in our field. Dogs have limitations, and there are special considerations in using them just as with any technique or tool. Despite their limitations, they provide the wildlife professional with abilities that cannot be otherwise replicated. The author's experience and available literature indicate that dogs are truly an underused tool. We hope that professionals find this information useful and consider methods that might be employed with dogs to better manage wildlife resources. In many instances, dogs' superior abilities can lead to better data collection and management. Current advances in techniques and technology such as DNA analysis, livestock protection, GPS technology, and statistical analysis increase the value of dogs for wildlife work. When used properly, man's best friend may in fact be a biologist's best asset. Use of dogs in wildlife research and management, 2020.
I'll be honest. I learned as much from my dogs doing research as I did telemetry, but just as much from the dogs and showing me grouse behavior and that kind of thing. But we have a lot of students who don't have a hunting background anymore. They didn't grow up hunting. And it's not their fault, they just didn't have a chance. So where do they get it?
I was one of those wildlife students. When I was going to school at Madison, up until my senior year, I had never been hunting before. I had zero experience. So I did a program called Conservation Leaders for Tomorrow, and its goal was to expose future biologists to the culture of their hunting constituents. I got to earn my hunter's safety certification through that program and ultimately shoot my first turkey the weekend after completing it.
So what you're saying is, without volunteers helping expose you, a then future wildlife professional, to hunting, you would have never ended up where you are today.
Exactly. So to me, this is a huge way that the public can get involved. Contact your local university's wildlife department or extension specialist and offer to expose interested students to hunting.
Cheat grows in dense stands, and each stem bears a mass of prickly awns which render the mature plant inedible to stock. To appreciate the predicament of a cow trying to eat mature cheat, try walking through it in low shoes. All field workers in cheat country wear high boots. These prickly awns cover the autumn hills with a yellow blanket as inflammable as cotton wool. It is impossible fully to protect cheat country from fire. As a consequence, the remnants of good browse plants, such as sagebrush and bitterbrush, are being burned back to higher altitudes, where they are less useful as winter forage. The lower fringes of pine timber, needed as winter cover for deer and birds, are likewise being singed back to higher levels. Aldo Leopold, 1949.
If you remember from our last episode, conifer encroachment was a big topic. Now, we're going to move on to the encroachment of cheatgrass.
Cheatgrass was originally brought to the U.S. from Eurasia, and its introduction was mostly accidental. A 2003 paper from the U.S. Forest Service states the introduction of cheatgrass to North America probably occurred independently several times via shipped ballast, contaminated crop seed, packing material, and at least one deliberate introduction for a college experiment in Pullman, Washington in 1898.
According to the North Dakota State Library, one of the first introductions through ballast dumps was in 1850 in St. Louis, Missouri. An introduction near Denver, Colorado originated from packing material or straw that was infested with cheatgrass seed.
As of 2024, cheatgrass covered over 100 million acres in the Intermountain West. This is a big deal because cheatgrass outcompetes native grasses and it's highly flammable. Its seeds are easily spread, and one plant can produce 25 to 5,000 seeds in 1 year. Thankfully, their seeds only remain viable for 1 to 2 years, which is exactly why I pull the cheatgrass growing in my yard every spring before it goes to seed.
Although cheatgrass spreads so easily and has covered thousands of miles, it isn't particularly nutritious or palatable for things like deer or cattle or even elk. In fact, the only thing we know that really eats it is chukar, and as much as we'd like that many chukar in the landscape, it's just never going to be the case. Cheatgrass is incredible at reproducing. In fact, that's part of how it got its name.
Cheatgrass is mostly an issue in the Great Basin. It's not as much an issue as we move up into the Wyoming basins and out towards the Great Plains, because that climate is so much more geared towards perennial grasses. We don't see it have as much takeover of systems as we do in the Great Basin. But what cheatgrass does is it actually cheats out other grasses of moisture and nutrients. That's its name, right? And so it'll come in, it'll actually grow during the winter. So it creates those little green shoots during the winter. And then as spring comes, it's up and going and eating up moisture and nutrients from the soil faster than our native perennials can go. So it cheats them out of those nutrients. But the biggest issue with cheatgrass is it's a tinderbox. Its tendency is to have lots of fire, and its fire return interval averages somewhere between 5 and 7 years. If you just had a monoculture of cheatgrass, that's going to burn every 5 to 7 years. And the problem is most sagebrush plants, well, almost all sagebrush plants, except a couple I can think of, don't resprout. They have to grow from seed. And so once you have fire take out the shrub component, you need a bunch of time for that to reseed and get going again. If you're at lower elevations, a lot of those sagebrush plants you're seeing are 30 to 60, 70 years old. It probably takes about 30 years to get back to that normal sage cover.
Historically, snow has been what's keeping cheatgrass from climbing higher and higher elevation-wise. However, recent data has shown that Utah has been experiencing wetter winters. However, it's not because it's snowing more, it's raining more. Rain actually helps cheatgrass cheat, and it continues to outcompete native vegetation while creeping up higher and higher.
Cheatgrass typically has not been a high elevation plant, so our high elevations have been insulated from the cheatgrass issue. One of the things that keeps cheatgrass out of the higher elevations is snowpack, because once we have snow, then cheatgrass can't cheat. It can't start its germination in the winter because snow is overlaying all that. But if we get less and less snow, cheatgrass can start to do its thing. However, some of the models recently I've been seeing from other people show cheatgrass is actually going a little bit higher and a little bit higher. And I've seen it myself in areas I work in. I got an area in southern Utah I work where I've had cheatgrass in aspen stands. And I'm like, this is crazy. That's the problem with cheatgrass is the fire return interval. And then sagebrush just can't get a hold again. Unfortunately, we don't have an answer. I remember I was up at a lab in Oregon that this is their thing. This is what they do. And I was like, okay, what's the solution to this problem of getting sagebrush back in a system, dealing with cheatgrass? They're like, we don't know. Like, if anybody should know, you should know. And they just didn't know because we just don't have the technology right now to overcome the cheatgrass issue.
Things like agriculture or fencing may not be deserving as much attention as they get. When we think of how Dave's 2/3 rules holds up true for sage grouse, the impacts of cheatgrass fueling a wildfire are far more impending of a challenge.
When it comes to sage grouse conservation, humans are doing a lot as far as research and active habitat management goes. However, something that Dave told us is really sticking with me, and it helped me understand why exactly habitat loss and fragmentation is so bad for sage grouse. It's because of their site fidelity, or rather, an area fidelity.
What's the role of fidelity in sage grouse habitat use? And what I mean by that is, we know if we get a hen and she puts a nest in this spot, most likely the next year she's going to be within a couple 100 yards of that spot for her next year's nest. It's not site fidelity. It's not like a heron rookery or something where they're going back to a built-in nest that they're going, or a golden eagle. They'll go back to these very specific sites they've already built. It's not like that. It's more like an area fidelity. So their seasonal habitat, home range just for that season, has a lot of overlap on a year-to-year basis. If we look at habitat selection for sage grouse and what they're doing, and I have a colleague up in Montana who's looked at some of this, they're finding that the fidelity issue actually determines habitat selection more than the habitat does. What that means is because a sage grouse has used an area, they're more likely to go back to the area even if it's not good for them. So, for example, you get a big fire comes through, there's not a lot of sagebrush cover. Their risk of mortality goes way, way up when there's not enough sagebrush cover, right? But they have fidelity to that spot, so they want to come back. And so they keep coming back and they just die quicker. We can restore habitat in some cases, but we can create great habitat that nothing wants to use because it's never used it before. So how do we create fidelity?
We have explored many types of issues threatening sage grouse in the Great Basin, whether they're naturally occurring or human-caused. The fact that sage grouse have such a high area fidelity can actually be a real problem, because if these areas degrade, those birds have a much lower chance of survival. They're going to return there and they're not going to find anything. And again, we have to remember at the scale at which this occurs. We're not just talking about 20 miles at a minimum, we're also talking about thousands of miles on the other end of the spectrum.
Clearly, for sage grouse, these concepts of space and fidelity are hugely important. Without space, they won't persist. Without protecting high fidelity areas, they won't persist. It seems to me like maintaining large swaths of high quality sage grouse habitat in areas within a 50-mile radius of high site fidelity are the most effective ways we can help these birds. And given that there's so many conservation issues and at the scale at which they occur is almost dumbfounding, it makes conserving sage grouse really, really difficult.
A lot of sage grouse work and management has gone to these local working groups. And that local working group is open to anybody who cares. You become a stakeholder as soon as you care. We welcome people to those local working group meetings. The state of Wyoming has a strong local working group program. And anybody who's interested can go and become part of those groups. They're based on regions or areas. There's what we call resource areas that group is in charge of looking over and managing for. After that, it's the whole political side and just showing your representatives that you care about these kinds of issues. I've been pleasantly surprised that people want to understand. Our representatives in general want to understand what our perspectives are. They're not natural resource experts for the most part. They need help making some of those decisions. That's a good thing. Lastly, get involved in some sort of NGO. Well, I'll just give you, this last Saturday, we had the Utah Chukar and Wildlife Foundation banquet. I had my grad students there so that hunters coming through, bird hunters mostly, they can see what research they're doing, because the Chukar Foundation gives me funding every year to support my research and try to help move this conservation needle along. Those are important things that we can all get involved in and put our efforts into.
A trend you're going to hear in a lot of these episodes is that funding and the manpower required for state and federal agencies to do these are very limited.
And it gets even trickier because one size doesn't fit all. We can't manage sage grouse the same way across their range because sagebrush ecosystems vary so widely.
While scientists are doing their part, including creating a national plan that accounts for the diversity of habitat across a large landmass, there is a huge need for more engagement and assistance from the public. Maybe more important today is making sure critical funding resources are directed at both research and management, even just being informed. These birds truly rely on us.
This can sound silly, but I'm a big Star Wars fan. First movie I ever went to as a kid was the second Star Wars. There's that line where they talk about everything's connected. We're all symbiotic life forms depending on each other. And there is some truth to that when it comes to ecosystems and life. I think we all should be reminded of as we deal with our ecosystem issues and challenges and risks as we move into the future.
If you have enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to our Patreon. There you will find our full-length interview with Dave Dahlgren, links to resources we used to create this episode, and more behind-the-scenes content. As a small business and independent storytellers, your support means everything to us. After all, these are your stories.
This episode was produced by myself, Gabby Zaldambide, AJ DeRosa, and Jennifer Wapensky. The editing of this episode was done by myself and AJ DeRosa. Special thanks to Associate Professor Rangeland Wildlife Extension Specialist at Utah State University, Dave Dahlgren.